Welcome to the first lecture for Introduction to Sociology. I am your instructor, Dr. Jessica Brown. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a few tips for how to take notes during these online lectures. How to take notes for this class. These lecture slides contain a lot of material. You will need to take notes as you watch them, and sometimes you may need to stop the video if you miss something. However, there are things I want you to focus on remembering, and things you don't need to worry about so much. Terms and ideas in bold are very important. You should know the definitions to them. Also, please pay attention to the major ideas, or the big picture ideas, the kinds of things that tie the whole story together. Slides also contain a lot of statistics. These are for your information, but they're not something I mostly test on, so unless I say otherwise, don't worry about copying down statistics. Let's get started. Human beings have always relied on theories to try to explain the social world, as well as the physical one. But because human behavior is so complex and is influenced by so many different factors, in many ways the social sciences, like sociology, psychology, and political science, have lagged behind the physical and biological sciences. In high school physics class, you might have had to do an exercise where you charted the course a pebble would take after being thrown off a cliff, using concepts like force, acceleration, and mass. But what if that pebble had a free will and a mind of its own? What if it could influence its own fall, the speed, the trajectory? And what if it sometimes refused to fall at all? How difficult would the study of physics be then? This is what physicist Murray Gell-Mann meant when he said, "Imagine how difficult physics would be if the particles could think for themselves." This is exactly the challenge that social scientists face every day. Sociology is the study of human behavior in a society. Sociologists use scientific methods such as experiments, interviews, surveys, and careful observation to measure human behavior. We also use theory to make sense of these measurements and observations and to help us understand the interplay of multiple complex factors on human behavior. However, because of the complexity of human behavior, sociology is probabilistic rather than strictly predictive. What this means is that human behavior is generally too complex to say with certainty what any one person will do in any given set of circumstances. Thinking sociologically. One of the most basic foundations of sociological thought is being able to, or at least trying to, understand how social forces shape our lives. Social forces refer to the influence that society and social institutions, such as school, the media, religion, etc., have on our beliefs, perceptions, and behaviors. This understanding of how we influence our social world and it influences us is what sociologist C. Wright Mills called the sociological imagination. The sociological imagination, according to Mills, refers to the ability to imagine and understand the intersection between personal experience and behaviors and historical social structures. This, he argued, was the essence of sociology, being able to imagine ways in which our lives are shaped by social forces. Mills argued that there were three components that formed the sociological imagination. Three things you had to understand about a society and its people if you wanted to understand them. The first was a society and people's history, how it came to be and how it is changing. The second is biography, what kind of people are valued or considered normal in a particular society. And finally, its social institutions, how the various institutional orders in a society operate, which ones are dominant, how they are held together, and how they might be changing. In the slides that follow, we'll look at each of these in a little bit more detail. The first element of the sociological imagination is history. History is how a society came to be and how it is changing. America, for example, is a bit unusual in our relationship toward firearms. The right to gun ownership is written into our Constitution, and we have some of the laxest gun control laws in the developed world. As a consequence of this, Americans own more handguns per capita than any other country. Yemen comes in second. Some of the explanation for this is likely rooted in our history. Our country was founded through an armed struggle for independence, and this may help to explain why guns are so fundamental to American culture for many people, and why so many Americans oppose gun control. The second part of the sociological imagination is biography. Biography asks the question, what human traits or characteristics does a society encourage, and which does it discourage or repress? Put more simply, what does it mean in a given society to be an ideal man, an ideal woman, or an ideal citizen? What kinds of people are considered to be normal and natural, and what kinds are considered to be abnormal, deviant, or even criminal? All societies have some idea about what it means to be an ideal person or a good citizen, and these can vary dramatically from society to society. For example, in Nazi Germany, the ideal man was someone who was tough, performed military service, and always practiced total obedience to the state. Both men and women in Nazi Germany also were expected to be quote unquote racially pure, meaning German Aryans. If you were a Jewish person or a Roma gypsy, for example, you were considered to be automatically deviant and criminal.
Growing up, what were you taught about what it meant to be a good U.S. citizen? If you didn't grow up in the United States, you can also answer the same question with respect to what you were taught it meant to be a good citizen of your home country. This doesn't have to be stuff you agree with, just the kinds of messages you got in school, from media, politicians, etc. Maybe a good citizen follows the law. But what about if you think the law is wrong? For example, civil rights leaders like Rosa Parks sometimes peacefully defied segregation laws, and modern day Americans are more likely to view them as heroes. What about paying taxes? Maybe, but in a 2016 debate, then presidential candidate Donald Trump told opponent Hillary Clinton that not paying federal income taxes made him smart rather than unpatriotic. Serving in the military? Again, but at any given time, less than 1% of Americans are active military personnel, and less than 10% have ever served. The last president to do military service in a combat zone was George H.W. Bush. Over the years I've taught this class, I've had students list lots of different messages they feel they received about what makes someone a good citizen, or what we might call the biography of a good American. Some feel that a good American must speak and use English, at least in public places. Some feel that it is un-American to fly or display other flags, such as the Mexican flag or Confederate flag. Others argue that the right to free speech means respecting both ideological and linguistic differences. What do you think?
The third element of the sociological imagination is social structures or social institutions. A social institution is defined as any complex social form that reproduces itself and helps to organize human behavior. A social institution can be small, like a family or a church, or very large, like a religion in its entirety or a government. When we say that a social institution is a complex social form, we mean something that usually involves multiple people acting in different roles, working in different capacities, and governed by rules. When we say that a social institution reproduces itself, we mean that it helps to perpetuate itself across generations. Businesses reproduce themselves by constantly hiring and training new workers, and promoting older, more experienced workers into higher levels of management. Thus, it ensures its own ability to live beyond the lifespan of any individual worker. A family reproduces itself in a more direct way, by giving birth to children and rearing them to grow up to form the families of the future. Finally, when we talk about social institutions organizing human behavior, we're talking about the way that they shape our lives. If you think about it, you can probably think of lots of ways that social structures or social institutions like schools or the legal system organize and impact our lives. They give us schedules, rules to follow, train us into various tasks, pass along moral and value systems and systems of knowledge, and so on. For Mills, understanding the role of social institutions meant understanding how the various institutional orders in a society operate, which ones are dominant, how they are held together, and how they might be changing. A good example of a kind of social institution that has a very strong impact on day-to-day life in the United States is our large for-profit corporations. These are major structuring elements in our society, and they shape our lives in lots of ways. They influence our government and laws by lobbying for policies that are preferential to them. They influence our environment by either polluting it or investing in and building clean technologies which help to keep it clean. They exert an impact on media by buying media organizations or paying for commercials, and so on. In addition to observational or experimental data, sociologists rely on theories to help us explain human behavior in the social world. There are hundreds of different theories in sociology, but in this class, we're going to focus on three really big ones, what we call the big three theoretical frameworks in sociology. The first is called functionalism, or the functionalist perspective. Credited largely to the work of sociologist Talcott Parsons, the functionalist perspective sees society as a complex system whose parts work together to promote stability. Basically, it assumes that if some aspect of social life does not contribute to society's survival, it will not be passed on from one generation to the next. For a functionalist, a social form may have either a manifest function or a latent function. The manifest function is the open or stated function of an institution, whereas a latent function is one or more unconscious or unstated function that institution or social form also performs. For example, the manifest or stated function of the public education system is to teach kids skills like reading, writing, and math. But the public education system performs a whole bunch of latent functions besides that one. For example, most American households have one or more parents who need to be in the labor force during the day. So the public school acts basically like a babysitter, supervising kids while their parents are out of the house to keep them from getting into trouble. The public education system also helps to socialize kids. They learn how to make friends, how to get along with other people. As they go through puberty, they get a chance to mix with other teenagers and learn stuff like how to talk to girls or boys or how to ask someone out on a date. Society's survival, our survival as a species, actually does require that we all learn this at some point. Kids learn other skills that they'll need for the workforce besides academic skills, like how to follow basic directions, how to sit school at a desk for a really long time, still a challenge for many of us, and in some cases, how to learn to act like we're paying attention even when we aren't. For functionalists, even something that seems dysfunctional, take for example gang crime, may continue to exist because it actually serves some societal purpose. It may have important latent functions that aren't being served or met by other social institutions. Street gangs create violence and chaos and crime in neighborhoods where they exist. But someone working from the functionalist perspective would argue that gang activity may persist because it meets certain needs that aren't being met elsewhere. For example, joining a gang can provide someone with protection in a dangerous neighborhood, in a place where the police maybe aren't as likely to come or be able to help if you're being harassed or stalked or threatened. A criminal gang can provide a source of income in a place where jobs are limited, although granted that income usually comes from some kind of illicit activity, like robbing people or selling drugs. Being a member of a street gang could be an avenue for gaining respect for people who feel disempowered, although that respect is earned through fear, for example, rather than real respect. A street gang can provide a surrogate family for young people from dysfunctional homes. Joining a gang can also provide an avenue for excitement and socialization for kids where safer options are not available. Some of the earliest street gangs were formed by inner city kids, mostly minority and immigrant kids, who were shut out of other social groups like the Boy Scouts and the YMCA during the era of segregation. During the era of legal segregation between blacks and whites, or what is sometimes called the Jim Crow era, those organizations were restricted to white children only. They didn't accept minority kids. With parents forced to work long hours in factories, for example, or as domestic workers to support their struggling household, the first street gangs were mostly just groups of unsupervised urban kids. Some did get involved in crime or fight with each other, but violence was rarely serious, and most crimes were petty crimes. Serious violence and more serious crimes came later, with the introduction of drugs like crack, the total collapse of urban economies, and the introduction of cheap guns. Finally, criminal gangs serve a function because there is, simply put, a high demand for drugs in most communities, and so someone needs to supply them. Criminal gangs are well suited to step into this particular economic role because you've got a whole population of unemployed young men and women who are willing to do the risky work of moving and selling product, as well as providing muscle for things like security, collecting money, making sure the competition doesn't get too close, and so on.
The second in our Big Three perspective, conflict theory, focuses more on inequality, how it comes to be, and how it is perpetuated. Conflict theory is often credited to Karl Marx, who Americans often don't like for a couple of reasons. Marx is known as the father of communism, and indeed, his writings, along with those of his frequent co-author, Friedrich Engels, argued for the overthrow of capitalist economies in favor of a communal system known as communism, in which working class people formed an essentially dictatorial government and private property was largely abolished. Marx believed that once the capitalist and ruling classes were gone and the workers were in charge, social problems would mostly disappear. There would be no need for government because the workers would all magically agree on the best way to run the country. Crime would be pretty much non existent because many of Marx's followers believed crime was caused by inequality, and in the workers' paradise, inequality would be a thing of the past. Former states like the USSR tried to implement these ideologies, but struggled in practice. Soviet police had to frame persistent crime as the work of anti revolutionary radicals, and so police forces often focused their efforts on rounding up accused enemies of the state, or just people that more powerful people didn't like, and deporting them to prison camps. Centrally planned economies caused shortages of goods and food because decisions about how much wheat to plant or toilet paper to manufacture were made by committees of political appointees, often far in advance. Inequality still existed and was rampant. As the party struggled to stay in power, it turned to restricting the freedoms of average citizens to keep them from revolting or escaping. But Marx wrote prolifically, and some of his theories remain popular among scholars. For example, Marx believed that conflict and struggles between the haves and the have-nots, the wealthy ownership class, or what he called the bourgeoisie, and the working men and women, who he called the proletariat, were the biggest drivers of change in human history. And we see a lot of social movements and even revolutions and wars driven by scarcity or inequality of resources. The idea that the people on top want to stay on top is also pretty self-evident. Rather than the functionalist perspective, which argues that social institutions will evolve to do the most good for the most people, a conflict theorist would argue that powerful groups will tend to structure institutions like law, education systems, the media, etc., to promote their own interests, even if that means wealth, power, and influence are not shared by all.
There are lots of good historical examples of conflict theory in action. The era of Jim Crow or legal segregation is a very good one. Jim Crow or segregation laws were written by white people to keep white people in power, even in southern communities where whites were a demographic minority. Blacks were legally forbidden from attending white schools or universities, which made it difficult for them to gain financial power by obtaining well paying jobs. Police in Jim Crow communities ignored or openly participated in violent attacks against blacks who tried to register to vote, thus preventing them from gaining political power. Pretty much every social institution in Jim Crow states participated to continue the system of racial inequality. The second tenet of conflict theory is the argument that privileged people will maintain power by structuring social institutions, such as the law, to perpetuate their own interests, or the interests of people like them. This can be very conscious and overt and intentional, as it was in the Jim Crow South, or it can happen unintentionally or unconsciously. For example, during the so-called crack epidemic of the 1980s, the federal government decided to deal with the increasingly visible problem of drug abuse by passing something called the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986. This law was an attempt to, quote, get tough on drug crime, and it created mandatory minimum sentences for possession of certain quantities of different illicit drugs. One thing about the law that was notable was it essentially singled out crack possession as a crime deserving of harsher punishments than possession of other illicit drugs, including crack's pharmacological cousin, powder cocaine. Under the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, a felon who was found in possession of 5 grams of crack or 500 grams of powder cocaine was instantly required to have a mandatory minimum 5-year prison sentence. Someone found in possession of either 50 grams of crack or 500 kilograms of powder cocaine was eligible for a 10-year minimum sentence. So, even though crack and powder cocaine are chemically and pharmacologically very similar, the law punished crack possession far more harshly than powder cocaine possession at a rate of 100 to 1. Why treat crack and powder cocaine so differently under the law? One difference between the two drugs is the populations that tend to use them. Powder cocaine is a drug that is mostly used or abused by wealthy people, specifically wealthy whites, whereas crack was a drug that was mostly associated with poor and minority communities, mostly in inner cities. The drafters of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act were following certain assumptions that I do not believe were consciously racist at their core, or at least I hope not. The crack wars had become a frightening and highly visible reality of life in many low-income urban communities, and because it was a relatively new drug, people didn't understand crack very well. Some believed that it was a super drug that was far more harmful than anything else out there. Some legislatures were, on the other hand, probably intimately familiar with powder cocaine as a substance that is commonly used, for example, at college fraternity parties or among circles of wealthy, high-achieving, and high-earning professionals. It didn't really scare them in the same way, and so they didn't single it out for punishment in the same way that they singled out crack. However, this sentencing discrepancy is one thing that people point to in helping to explain the explosion in the prison population, and specifically the disproportionate rates of imprisonment between poor blacks and members of other communities. Most racial and ethnic groups tend to use drugs at about the same rate, although there are some differences in the kinds of drugs that members of particular racial and ethnic groups use compared to members of other racial and ethnic groups. For example, whites' use of powder cocaine is nearly 2 times that of blacks, but blacks are slightly more likely to use crack. Something like 5% of blacks and 3.4% of whites admitted to ever having used crack in a recent federal survey. So blacks are more likely to use crack than whites, though not by a huge extent. Because, however, the law singled out crack use for harsher penalties than powder cocaine use, the law created a de facto racial bias in sentencing. Between 1990 and 2010, black youth were arrested for drug crimes at more than double the rates of white youth, despite comparable use rates of drugs between both groups.
The 2010 Fair Sentencing Act, which came through Congress with at least some support from both parties and was signed into law by President Barack Obama, eliminated some, but not all, of the crack powder cocaine sentencing disparity. While some lawmakers pushed for a bill that would have eliminated the disparity completely, there was pushback from those who felt crack should still be punished more harshly because its trade was associated with higher rates of violence. The Fraternal Order of Police, for example, lobbied against sentencing parity by citing a U.S. Sentencing Commission study showing that 29% of all crack cases from October 1, 2008 through September 30, 2009 involved a weapon, compared to only 16% for powder cocaine. Others argued that crack was inherently more dangerous or addictive, although this is debatable. In a 2007 study, the same U.S. Sentencing Commission argued that there was no pharmacological evidence that crack had more deleterious effects on the body of the user or on a fetus or embryo in the case of pregnant users. They also cited evidence disproving the assumption that it was more addictive than powder cocaine, though they did posit that certain drug delivery methods could more easily lead to addiction. For example, smoking or injecting cocaine is thought to create dependency faster than snorting it. Ultimately, as is so often the case in politics, a compromise was reached that reduced the disparity to 18 to 1, eliminated the 5-year minimum for first time offenders, and was retroactive, meaning that people currently serving time under the older sentencing guidelines could be eligible for early release. Interestingly, even today, crack trafficking cases tend to be singled out for elevated penalties compared to other drugs that are arguably just as dangerous, or in practice, more so. While fentanyl and other opioid drugs are responsible for over 70% of all overdose deaths in the United States, the average sentence for crack cocaine trafficking at the time of this recording is still longer than the average sentence for fentanyl trafficking by 14 months. What do you think? Do you think crack cocaine possession or trafficking should be punished more harshly than possession or trafficking of other drugs? Should the law treat all illicit drugs the same, or should some be singled out for more severe punishments? Previously, we talked about how the functionalist perspective can help us understand the persistence of gang crime, despite all attempts to eradicate it. Understanding gang crime through the lens of the conflict perspective is pretty straightforward. A conflict theorist would argue that gangs, which tend to be the most common in poor, marginalized communities, represent a classical example of the have-nots trying to create pathways to economic success that they feel are not available through lawful or legitimate means. One historical example is the growth of so-called mafia organized crime networks in the United States. The early 1900s saw large waves of migration to the U.S. from Italy and other parts of southern and eastern Europe. Italian migrants were mostly coming from poor rural communities, looking for economic opportunity in the enormous labor markets of the United States. Many found it, though many others found themselves packed into overcrowded slums and facing hostility and discrimination from native-born Americans who distrusted them either because of their Italian ancestry or in some cases because of their Catholic faith. Most native-born U.S. whites at the time were Protestant Christians, and anti-Catholic prejudice was widespread. Though most Italian migrants were law-abiding, some did famously begin to build the organized crime networks that came to be known as the Mafia, and were later dramatized and often romanticized in popular media, like the movie The Godfather and the TV series The Sopranos. Despite stereotypical associations of mafia with Italian migrant communities, it is of course important to note that criminal gangs and organized crime networks can be found in a wide range of communities all over the world. One criticism to the conflict perspective interpretation of crime, and maybe especially gang crime, as a means for poor people to find pathways to economic success that are blocked to them otherwise, is that gang crime mostly doesn't play out as a struggle between rich and poor. Gang crime most commonly involves poor people targeting other poor people. It's also often not particularly successful. Gang members are more likely to end up in prison, injured, or dead than they are to end up wealthy, and whatever profits gang crime does manage to amass, from theft or drug trafficking, usually don't trickle down to street-level players. A Sentencing Commission project report from 2003 estimated that the average monthly salary for a drug dealer in the United States was about $751 a month. That would be about $1,300 a month in today's money, which wouldn't get you a one-bedroom apartment in most major cities.
Both the conflict perspective and the functionalist perspective tend to be what we call macro, and in some cases also meso-level theories, whereas our third theoretical perspective, symbolic interactionism, or the interactionist perspective, is more of what we think of as a micro-level analysis. To distinguish between the three, think about a camera that can zoom out to take a picture of an entire crowd of thousands of people, or can zoom in on a single subject. The macro level of analysis, macro means big, focuses on the role that big social institutions, the entire government, the whole legal system, the economy, play in shaping human behavior. The meso level takes an intermediate or middle level view, looking at specific smaller institutions or social movements. So, for example, whereas a macro level analyst might look at the entire education system, a meso level analyst might focus on a particular school. In some cases, meso-level analysis will also concern itself with the interplay between the macro and micro levels. And third is micro-level analysis. Micro means small, think microscope. This is a level of analysis that focuses on the study of individuals, interactions between individuals, and small group processes. Members of the interactionist perspective, or adherents to the school of what is sometimes called symbolic interactionism, concern themselves with this third micro level. They look at the way that people create identity and meaning through their interactions with other people. The symbolic interactionist argues that human beings basically function like performers on a stage, using symbol systems like languages, religious and political affiliations, clothing and fashion, and taste in music or art to constantly create performances of identity for other people. This performance of identity helps to define us both for ourselves and for others. One of the best-known names associated with symbolic interactionism, or the interactionist perspective, is Erving Goffman. Goffman did a lot of work on how people build identities through interactions with other people and through their interactions with social institutions as well. Goffman was best known for his ethnographic work. Ethnography is the scientific observation of people in social situations over long periods of time. For his book Asylums, he worked as a physical therapist assistant in a psychiatric hospital. He was interested in how people manage their behaviors to create positive presentations of themselves to other people, including how people with stigmatized identities, such as institutionalized patients, did this. Goffman called this process impression management and felt that all individuals worked to create specific presentations of self or enact different roles to satisfy particular audiences. The roles we play change depending on who our audience is. Minorities in the United States will often speak of needing to code switch, to talk, dress, act, and self-present slightly differently around whites than they do when they're around members of their racial group. If they don't learn to, quote, talk white in white company, whites will brush them off as unprofessional or even dangerous. But if they keep it up when they're around other members of their racial group, they get accused of trying to act white. It's a fine line, and it isn't just minorities who do this. Women in male-dominated occupations will talk about having to learn to code switch and talk, quote, more like men, more loud, more authoritatively, to get respect from their male colleagues. Southerners will often speak of the need to minimize their accents when talking to people from other regions to avoid being made fun of or seeming unsophisticated. We all code switch sometimes, though members of less dominant social groups will generally need to do it more often. The work that people do to present positive images of themselves to other people is sometimes called face work. Face work builds on the notion of a metaphorical face, which represents how an individual is viewed, that is, respectfully or not, by others in an interaction. Face work can be done on behalf of yourself. You might behave in such a way as so as to make yourself look smarter or more competent to someone you want to respect you. Or it can be done on behalf of an individual or group. So you could act in such a way so as to make your family look good, or present a positive impression of the organization you work for. Goffman's theories are sometimes called the dramaturgical approach, insofar as they compare everyday social interaction to the work of actors performing varied roles on stage. We constantly enact face work, both consciously and unconsciously, because we usually want to present a positive image of ourselves to other people. And there are lots of different ways that we can do this. America is a very success-oriented culture, wherein people with more money or career success tend to be given more respect and better treatment than people who just work hard but don't become fabulously wealthy. Not all cultures are like that. Some place higher values on being a good son or a daughter to your parents, for example, or being a good friend, or being kind, or having strong spiritual values. But America tends to be a materialistic culture, wherein being poor is often treated as being very shameful. We are also a consumerist culture, wherein people are encouraged to buy expensive goods to project images of power, wealth, or importance. This, too, is an example of face work, or what is sometimes called conspicuous consumption, something we'll talk about later in the semester, which is the purchasing of particular products, specifically expensive or high-value products, to present a positive image of the self to other people. Getting back to street gangs again. Earlier, we talked about how a functionalist would explain the persistence of street gangs by looking at the kind of functions they fill. For example, by providing young people with a way to make money in neighborhoods without jobs, or acting as a means of protecting yourself in a high crime neighborhood where police presence isn't very effective. A member of the interactionist perspective would also look at how getting involved in criminal activity fills certain needs for some people. For example, in a wealth and success obsessed culture like ours, being poor is a stigmatized identity, something people are made to feel ashamed of. For some young people, then, joining a street gang might be a way to compensate by adopting a performance of self that projects toughness, status, and wealth. While any person will play multiple roles over the course of a single day student, employee, friend, daughter, sister, mother the roles we choose to adopt, or the roles that are chosen for us, can also have long lasting consequences, because, over time, they shape how other people treat us. An early adoption or imposition of a criminal identity, for example, can have long lasting consequences. The first time a kid gets involved in gang activity, he or she might be very young. The average age of gang initiation in the United States is 14 years of age. Gangs seek out young kids for good reason. They're easy to manipulate and can get away with doing crimes in a way that adults can't. However, once a child begins to enact this particular role, that of the young gang member, it may be harder and harder for them to come back from it. This is the root of a labeling theory posited by interactionist and criminologist Howard Becker. Becker argued that the process of labeling someone as a deviant or a criminal, for example, creates a self-fulfilling prophecy that encourages future deviant behavior. Simply put, someone who engages in one crime might eventually become a lifelong criminal, simply because other people start defining them that way, and that definition starts to shape their experiences until it becomes a reality. If you take a kid who's committed a petty crime, say shoplifting, and define him as a juvenile delinquent, you slap that label on him. Suddenly, you start treating him differently. People around him might look at him with contempt and mistrust and start treating him worse. Maybe he's ashamed and withdraws from his friends and family, or gets angry and starts acting more rebellious. Maybe he gets punished and spends some time in a juvenile detention facility, where he meets a new set of friends who coach him on how to commit bigger, more serious crimes. While he is being punished, incarcerated or suspended, for example, he loses time in school, so he falls behind. He gets into trouble again. People's attitudes toward him begin to harden. He starts seeing himself as they see him. And his juvenile record makes it hard for him to get a legitimate job, so he keeps stealing. Over time, as a byproduct of that early delinquent label, he slides farther and farther into crime. And with each crime he commits, it becomes harder and harder for him to come back. In this way, our performances of self and the roles that we play have real consequences, in a way that the characters that actors on a stage decide to play do not. This concludes our lecture on sociological theory. Many of these ideas are explored in greater detail in your assigned readings. Thank you so much for listening.